The fire had nearly gone out when Jonathan Wren stepped barefoot into the dew-soaked grass behind his cottage. A sliver of frost clung to the garden's stone path, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and the drying remnants of late autumn lavender. In his right hand, crumpled and damp from his sweat, he held the letter, the one he had neither the courage to give nor the gall to destroy. The folds were worn thin, the edges curled like old birch bark, and yet he had rewritten it thrice just that evening, each draft more hesitant than the last. It was just past 4 in the morning, that strange hour, when the world still belongs to shadows and the soul grows too restless for sleep. From inside the old Wiltshire cottage came the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock, steady as the beat of a drum before a march. Upstairs, Marianne still slept. Her breathing had settled into the soft lull of deep slumber, unaware that her husband had been prepared not an hour before to leave her life behind altogether. Beside the garden bench stood the remnants of a travel bag, one strap frayed, zip slightly bent, and beside it the family estate car with the boot still ajar. A pair of gloves rested on the bonnet, as though Jonathan had once set them down mid-decision and forgotten what he meant to do next. There had been a moment, brief, decisive, when his hand gripped the ignition key with such finality that even the moon seemed to hold its breath, but he had faltered. Not from guilt, nor from fear, but from something deeper, a shadow that had settled behind his ribs and refused to name itself. He now stared at the fire pit, at the last glowing coal that refused to die, and with it the letter that had not yet burned. Rain began to fall slow at first, then more insistently, as if the heavens themselves wished to intervene. The embers hissed beneath the droplets, and the letter in his hand sagged under the weight of water. Still, he could not cast it into the pit. The distant sound of an engine echoed up the lane, unusual at such an hour, in a village where even the hedgehogs knew better than to stir before light. Jonathan turned his face slightly, his jaw tightening. It could be nothing, it could be everything. And still, Marianne slept. She was not a woman given to dramatics. A schoolteacher for 30 years, steady as a lighthouse, and nearly as solitary, Marianne had once endured the slow, painful death of her mother's mind to dementia without complaint, refusing to send her to a care home. Duty is not a burden when one accepts it, she had told Jonathan during one of their early walks across the downs, her voice quiet but resolute. He had loved her for that. And yet, he had not trusted her with the truth. What truth? That was the riddle. The letter, he dared not read it again lest he lose his nerve, entirely contained not a confession, but a reckoning. In it lay the ghost of a name he had long tried to forget, Clara. Clara, whose name was never spoken in the house, whose memory Jonathan had buried beneath layers of respectability and seasonal charity events and Sunday lunches with the vicar and his wife. Clara, who was not dead, but perhaps something worse, remembered by another, raised by another, named by another. There had been a phone call that morning, unexpected, curt. "Mr. Wren," the voice had said, "your brother's passed. He left something for you, and a note, said it was urgent, best come to Cornwall." The man had not introduced himself. There was something in the tone, clipped and precise, that suggested he knew far too much. Edward, his older brother, estranged these last 10 years, and now suddenly dead. Jonathan's knees had buckled slightly upon hearing it, not from grief but from the abrupt lifting of a weight he hadn't realized he still carried. Edward had been a man of hard convictions and secret philosophies. He had spoken often of ancient texts and impermanent truths of duty as a blade rather than a balm. It was Edward who had once offered to take in the child, to spare Jonathan the public scandal. "I'll raise her in silence," he had said. "You'll owe me nothing except the wisdom to stay away." Jonathan had agreed. He had fled, and in fleeing had sealed the walls of his conscience with mortar made from cowardice and rationalization. Until this night. The fire hissed again. Somewhere behind the hedgerow, a fox barked a sharp metallic sound that shattered the stillness. Jonathan flinched, and the letter dropped from his hand, tumbling onto the wet grass like a fallen oath. He bent to retrieve it, but the paper had already darkened, ink bleeding in serpentine streaks. He paused, his fingers trembling above it. What would Marianne say? He imagined her at the breakfast table in her flannel robe, reading the Morning Post, unaware that the man opposite her had built their life atop a quiet treason. Would she leave him? Would she forgive? The old elm tree at the edge of the garden moaned softly under the wind. For a moment, Jonathan stood perfectly still, not breathing. Somewhere between sky and earth, between past and future, he was suspended, neither man nor ghost, but something aching to be unburdened. The engine drew closer. Headlights split the hedgerow. A silver saloon car, unfamiliar, crept up the gravel drive. It stopped before the gate. No one stepped out. The engine idled. Jonathan remained rooted to the spot, bare feet numbed by cold and damp. He wondered, not for the first time, if Edward had not in some final act of bitterness left behind more than a letter, perhaps a visitor, perhaps Clara herself. The car lights dimmed, the engine stopped, and still no movement. Jonathan, soaked and shivering, turned toward the house, toward Marianne's sleeping form, toward a marriage built not on deceit, but on a carefully pruned truth. He did not yet move. The rain fell heavier now. Time had grown thick, like a hallway lined with closed doors. And behind one of those doors, something waited. The fire pit exhaled its last coal. The letter, forgotten once more, lay heavy and silent in the grass. The letter from Cornwall had arrived just after noon the day before, tucked between a dull bank statement and a charity appeal, neither of which Jonathan had bothered to open. The envelope was thick, cream-coloured, and bore the faint imprint of a solicitor's office from Truro, Everett, Langley, and Sharp. The name stirred something unpleasant in his chest, like the acrid taste of iron that rises in the mouth before bad news. The postmark had been smudged, but he recognized the writing on the interior note, immediately precise, old-fashioned, with a stiffness that betrayed its writer's distaste for sentiment. Edward Wren, even in death, had not loosened his hand. The words were few. I am gone. You will find what you deserve in the chapel at Lower Lerin. Bring nothing but your conscience. No signature, no warmth, just the same cold arithmetic Edward had always applied to human matters, sin, consequence, reparation. It was not so much an invitation as a summons, and it had arrived like a stone dropped in the still pond of Jonathan's carefully measured life. He had not been to Cornwall in 17 years, not since the estate had been sold in fragments to cover Edward's debts and silence rumours best left to fade. Lower Lerin was a hamlet now, scarcely remembered even by its nearest neighbours, nestled between overgrown hedgerows and crumbling lanes, where sheep roamed unchecked and ivy scaled, abandoned walls like ancestral ghosts returning home. The chapel, if it still stood, had once belonged to their maternal grandfather, a man of Anglican rigidity and superstitious fervour. The place had always felt more pagan than Christian, cold, damp, and full of eyes that were not quite painted in the stained glass. Jonathan had stood over the letter for some time, the sounds of a village afternoon continuing unnoticed beyond the kitchen window. A tractor hummed in the distance, a pair of starlings pecked at the feed tray near the garden wall, and somewhere in the lanes, old Reverend Dawlish's Labrador barked without pause, as if protesting a world grown too full of secrets. Marianne, seated in the sunroom with her school papers, glanced up briefly and asked if he was quite all right. He had merely nodded and replied something inconsequential about the bank. But something in his voice had faltered, and she had marked it. She always did. 30 years of marriage had taught her to read the pauses between his words as fluently as the words themselves. Jonathan knew he would go to Cornwall. There had never been any true choice in the matter. Edward's death had done nothing to soften the distance between them. Indeed, it had only magnified it like a hollow echo heard across a chasm. And yet there was that name Clara, though not written it, pressed through the envelope like a watermark, unseen yet indelible. He remembered the last time he had seen her, only a baby wrapped in wool, and sorrow her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Edward had taken her in without ceremony, stating flatly that neither Jonathan nor the mother, a woman named Eliza Blake, had the courage or stability to raise a child born in scandal. And to Jonathan's eternal shame, he had not fought him. Eliza had vanished not long after. There were whispers of an aunt in Devon, a private hospital, some facility funded discreetly and staffed with people who knew how to keep records from becoming public. Jonathan had once written to her. No reply ever came. The drive to Cornwall had taken longer than expected. The lanes were narrower than memory allowed, and the mist off the moors clung stubbornly to the windscreen. As he approached Lerrin, the radio offered only static and the occasional weather bulletin from a station in Falmouth. The fields on either side of the road had surrendered to winter. Hedges stood skeletal, and sheep clustered together like old men huddled for warmth. Nothing stirred in the village when he arrived. No children, no dogs, only a solitary post van idling near the market square. He had parked beneath the yew trees that still flanked the chapel gate. The structure itself looked untouched by time and equally untouched by affection. Moss covered the slate roof and ivy curled possessively around the stone arch. The air smelled of damp lichen and something older, something that made the hairs on his arms rise. A blackbird called sharply from the bell tower, then flew off without ceremony. The chapel door groaned on its hinges as he entered. The interior was as he remembered, narrow, candlelit, heavy with the perfume of wax and dust. At the front, where once a pulpit stood, there was now only a wooden chest, dark walnut, inlaid with a single brass lock. Upon it rested a folded piece of paper and a key. His name was written across the paper in Edward's hand. He hesitated before touching it. The silence in the chapel was of the kind that presses into the chest like a burden. It had a weight, a presence, as though the very stones bore witness. He unfolded the note. There were only 9 words. You took her from me, but she found me. The key in his hand trembled slightly. He looked again at the chest, a box shaped not for valuables but for memories, perhaps confessions. The last line of Edward's handwriting seemed almost calm, as if he had finally accepted the limits of human reason and passed into the resignation of the inevitable. Within the chest he found a photograph, a small locket, and a letter in a second unfamiliar script. The photograph was of a girl perhaps 19 or 20, standing in a field of heather. Her gaze was fixed on the camera, unblinking, with eyes grey as coastal fog. Her face bore traces of both Wren brothers Jonathan's brow, Edward's chin, but her expression was not recognizable. It was as if she had never been a child at all, but something born fully aware, observing the world rather than belonging to it. The locket contained no portrait, only a lock of pale hair curled like a question mark. The letter was sealed. He did not yet open it. As he locked the chest again and stepped out into the dim light of late afternoon, Jonathan realized the sky above Cornwall had darkened without his noticing. Clouds gathered like jurors, and the wind had turned from gentle to sharp. Something had begun to move, not outside, but within. A reckoning long postponed had taken root. And in its shadow walked Clara. Where she was now he could not guess, but the game, if that was what it had been, had shifted. The past long buried beneath the decorum of middle age and the soft routines of a Wiltshire village had stirred, and with it came a question for which he had no answer. Had Edward raised her as a daughter or shaped her into something else entirely? The moorland sky hung low over the southern ridge of Bodmin that morning, thick with slate-hued clouds that threatened a fine, persistent rain. Jonathan stood beneath the arch of the ruined chapel's lich gate, one hand still curled tightly around the iron key he'd taken from the chest inside. It was an old key, the sort that belonged to another century, its shaft heavy, its teeth worn by the oils of time. In the pocket of his waxed jacket lay the photograph of the girl, her expression, unwavering, the eyes, speaking less of lineage and more of some silent inquest. There had been another note hastily scrawled, tucked beneath the locket. The rest lies where we began. If you have courage, return. Jonathan had known at once where that meant. It was not a destination commonly spoken of, even in the memory-soaked dialect of his youth. On the map, it would be little more than a patch of trees south of Tregony, a wood whose name had faded from formal cartography, but which locals still called Gannell's Rest. Once in the years when he and Edward had shared something more tender than rivalry, they had hidden away in that glade, collecting beetles in jam jars and carving their initials into ash trees with penknives stolen from the gardener's shed. But even as children they had sensed a strangeness in that place, a silence, not quite natural, a listening stillness. Their grandfather had warned them against playing there after dusk. The old roads run beneath it, he had said. Once eyes narrowed, and the old paths remember debts. It had taken the better part of an hour to reach the site by car. The old access lane had become choked with gorse and creeping bramble, forcing him to leave the vehicle some distance away and proceed on foot. The land rose and fell unevenly, like the bones of something ancient pressing up through the soil. Wind passed through the trees with a hush that felt ceremonial, as if announcing a guest, long expected, but long feared. The glade, when he reached it, looked unchanged, though age had thickened the trunks, and moss now dressed the roots in solemn green. At the center stood a half-buried stone, rectangular and smooth, like the lid of some forgotten altar. It bore no inscription, only a faint channel down its middle, where water had worn its passage over centuries. Behind it, half concealed beneath a yew's gnarled boughs, was the old granite tool shed, now little more than rubble. There, lodged beneath a flagstone, he found the tin box. It was rusted at the seams, but still serviceable. The lid bore no ornament, save a faint scratch, deliberate it seemed, shaped into a near circle, as though someone had drawn a moon with a knife. Jonathan prized it open, and immediately inhaled the familiar scent of mildew metal and paper long sealed. Within lay the expected, yet wholly unprepared for contents, a folded letter on heavy parchment and a small silver chain threaded with 3 pendants, across a key, and a charm bearing the Wren family crest. But what shook him most was the photograph. It had been pressed between the letter and the lid, its surface slightly crinkled, but the image crisp. A young woman, Clara, unmistakably stood at the edge of a cliff, the wind in her hair, a dark overcoat draped over her shoulders like a mantle. Behind her, gulls wheeled in a storm-dark sky, and the outline of a ruined abbey loomed in the distance. She appeared both exposed and invulnerable, like a sentinel stationed at the threshold between worlds. He sat heavily upon the stone, the photograph trembling slightly in his grip. The pendant chain clinked softly as it slipped into his lap, a sound like bells far off in fog. The letter addressed in Edward's hand bore no salutation. It began as if mid-thought. You never understood what she was. You only saw the scandal, the sin, the inconvenience, but I, perhaps through madness, or perhaps through that cruel clarity that befalls the guilty, saw her as she would become. There followed a passage of near theological prose, dense with reference to Zen parables, old monastic fragments, and obscure citations from the sutras. Edward had spent years absorbing the esoteric. Jonathan remembered this obsession from their youth, how Edward would retreat for days into the upper rooms of the estate, with nothing but a Japanese-English dictionary and the Blue Cliff record emerging gaunt and irritable, but with an unsettling calm in his eyes. She was not raised in hatred, the letter continued, but neither was she comforted. I offered her stillness, solitude, and a discipline rooted in impermanence. She asked no questions, only listened. I gave her no name until she chose her own. Jonathan paused, the wind rising around the trees, whispering in dialects that predated human tongue. So Clara had not grown up in the expected manner. She had not sat through grammar lessons, nor danced at village fêtes, nor received birthday cakes frosted with nursery candles. She had lived in some kind of isolation, mentored in silence, unburdened by the entitlements of modern childhood. The letter closed abruptly. If you have seen her eyes, then you know. Do not try to claim her. She is no longer something to be claimed. She will come to you in her own hour. What remains for you is not to win her affection, but to endure her judgment. There was no signature, just the impression of a ring pressed in wax, now half smudged and barely legible. Jonathan folded the paper and returned it to the box, though the words had already impressed themselves into his memory like carvings on cathedral stone. He held the chain a moment longer before placing it gently atop the letter. A sound behind him, the crack of a twig, made him start, but when he turned, there was nothing but the wood waiting indifferent. He lingered there, unwilling to rise, caught between the density of what had been revealed and the terror of what it implied. In that glade surrounded by trees older than any memory, the air felt thick with expectation. Somewhere Clara still walked the land, not hidden but veiled, not lost but waiting. And for the first time in many years, Jonathan felt the stirrings of something that had nothing to do with shame or regret. It was dread, yes, but not dread of punishment. It was the dread one feels when standing before something sacred and strange, something whose judgment will not be stayed by blood or apology. He stood at last, his limbs reluctant, as if the very soil urged him to remain. But the sky had begun to darken, and the path back to the car would be treacherous once the light failed. As he walked away, the pendant chain still glinted faintly in his palm, and the wind carried with it the faintest trace of laughter, neither mocking nor warm, but simply aware. She had found him. The game had not ended. It had merely begun. By the time Jonathan returned to Wiltshire, the light had thinned to a dim copper hue that pressed long shadows across the hedgerows. The village of Redcombe, with its mossy roofs and soot-streaked chimneys, lay, as it always had, unchanged in its habits, as if the rhythms of sheep bells and tea kettles might keep chaos at bay. The familiar sight of the old church steeple rising above the elms offered little comfort. If anything, it stood like a needle piercing the quiet sky, a reminder of conscience pricked and bleeding. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he pulled into the drive. A pair of sparrows flitted away from the rosemary bush near the gatepost. All appeared calm, yet an unfamiliar tension hovered. The upstairs window was open curtain stirring, though the day had grown unseasonably cold. That small detail unsettled him more than it should have. Marianne did not come to greet him. Inside the house bore its usual scent, lavender polish, the faintest trace of the fire's smoke from the morning, but something in the air had changed, like the aftermath of a storm not quite visible. On the hallway table, beside his unopened letters, lay a sprig of bay from the garden, Marianne's habit. She would leave small tokens about the house, half practical, half ceremonial symbols of protection, of cleansing. They had once laughed about it, her quiet, almost priestly rituals, his steadfast resistance to anything remotely mystical. That laughter seemed to belong to another couple long gone from this house. He found her in the sunroom. The room was cool, the window ajar, letting in a crisp breeze. Marianne sat in her usual chair, her back straight, the afternoon light striking the greying strands in her dark hair. She was reading, or appearing to read, a leather-bound journal. Not one of her own, and not his either. Jonathan recognized it with a sinking heart. The brass corners, the faded spine. It was his old journal, kept during that brief and wretched period when Clara's name had first entered his life. Marianne closed the book as he entered. Her hands were calm, folded neatly over the cover. Her face betrayed nothing, no fury, no sadness, not even contempt. Only weariness, vast and quiet, like the hush of an empty church after the candles are extinguished. "You left it in the boot of the car," she said, her voice as even as a judge's. Jonathan stood by the door, his coat still on. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. "I didn't think—" "No," she interrupted gently. "You didn't." She gestured to the seat opposite. "Sit, please." Obediently, he did. The cushion let out a soft sigh beneath him. The winter sun filtered through the window panes, casting a muted pattern across the carpet. "I have read all of it," Marianne said. "Not just the entries about her, all of it. The pages about your father, your brother, that place in Cornwall, the ones you wrote in pencil then crossed out. I suppose you hoped I'd never find it, or perhaps you wanted to be found out in your own quiet way. I'm not certain which is worse." Jonathan looked down at his hands. The knuckles were raw from the cold, and a thin line of dried blood curved around the bed of one fingernail where bramble had torn it. A fitting wound, he thought, for a man who had spent his life skirting the thorns of his own cowardice. "I wanted to tell you. Years ago," he murmured. "Then you should have," she replied. Her voice did not rise. She was not a woman who gave herself over to rage. Her strength had always been quieter, forged from steadiness and patient expectation. "You should have Jonathan. Because I am not some delicate reed to be shielded from gales. I am your wife. I have grown grey beside you. I nursed your mother. I buried mine. I deserved the truth, not this half-life." He raised his eyes, but she did not meet them. Instead, she unfolded a piece of paper from beneath the journal. It was the drawing, Clara's drawing, that he had tucked inside the back pocket weeks earlier and forgotten. A child's hand had drawn it, but not in the ordinary manner. The lines were meticulous, deliberate: a cottage, a man by the gate, a woman looking from the window, and in the foreground a girl beneath a tree, half-shadowed, her face devoid of expression. The caption written in large, careful letters: "I see you." Marianne's fingers trembled slightly as she handed it to him. "You were going to leave," she said. "Last night, weren't you?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "I saw the packed case, the gloves. The car moved down the drive before it returned. I didn't come down then. I suppose I wanted to see whether you'd flee or remain." Her voice faltered for the first time, and in that crack, he saw something of the young woman she had once been before grief and patience and decades of unsaid things. "I came back," he said softly. "But not to me." The words struck with the finality of a gavel, and she was right. He had returned not from love, but from fear, from dread of what awaited him on the road, and perhaps worse, from what he might find if he reached the end of it. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself mute beneath the weight of his own history. After a moment she rose, walked to the fireplace, and placed the journal and the drawing upon the grate. She did not strike a match, not yet. Instead, she turned to him. "I do not know who this Clara is," she said, "but I know now that she is part of you. And if she comes—" Jonathan stood. "She already has." The room stilled. The wind rattled the window pane, and the light dimmed as a bank of cloud passed over the sun. Marianne lowered her gaze. "Then I shall meet her," she said, "but I will not be lied to again. If she brings fire, so be it. I will not flinch from it." And at last, she met his eyes. In them, he saw not forgiveness, but something else: resolution. It was a gaze that spoke of ancestral virtue, of centuries of English wives who had kept the land, the hearth, and the dignity of their homes while the world about them crumbled. She would stand, and he, if he wished to remain, her husband, would need to do the same. Outside, the sky darkened. A crow called from the chimney, and within the hearth, the unlit journal weighted its pages, trembling in the draught, as if already aware of the judgment that had been passed. Jonathan spent much of the following morning in his study, surrounded by the muted ticking of the mantel clock and the soundless scorn of the past. The fire had been lit, but it gave off more smoke than heat, and he did not bother adjusting the damper. The journal now lay beside him on the bureau, its pages marked with small silent trespasses of memory, each line evidence of a former self he no longer recognized. The photograph from the tin box Clara at the cliff's edge rested atop a file of older documents he had once hidden among insurance papers and tax receipts. In the cold light of day, her image retained that strange, disquieting power. It was not merely the clarity of her gaze or the eerie resemblance to himself and Edward. It was something else, something in the poise of her figure, the unnatural calmness, the absolute self-possession of a woman who had never been taught to apologize for her existence. And then there was the troubling arithmetic of years. Clara had been born in 2004. That he knew with the certainty of a man who had once counted weeks in secrecy and dread. If this photograph were recent, and it bore every mark of such, then the girl should be 20. And yet the woman in the frame appeared perhaps no more than 16, 17 at most. There was no sign of youthful affectation, no garish attire or painted defiance. Her coat was plain, the sort one might associate with post-war governesses or country nurses. It seemed impossible, almost absurd, and yet there she was, timeless or untethered. He had attempted to return to his writing, to marshal something, resembling order from the chaos of revelation, but the words would not come. Instead, he took up his pen and began composing a letter, not to Clara. He had not the right. No, this was addressed to Edward, though the man now lay beneath Cornish soil, if indeed he had been buried at all. The act of writing was less communication than confession, a silent pouring of ink that might, if Providence were merciful, unburden something heavier than parchment. "Brother," he began, "you once said that truth, when left unattended, breeds wildness. I now see what you meant." He paused. The fireplace crackled softly. A gust of wind stirred the ivy outside, casting flickering shadows on the wall, as though a procession of monks passed by, heads, bowed robes trailing. "Why did you not tell me she was alive? Or rather, why did you not allow her to find me before now? Did you believe I would turn her away? Or worse, claim her as mine for pride or pity?" He set the pen down. Writing to the dead was a task for the desperate or the devout, and he was neither. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. In that moment, the house creaked, one of those ordinary sounds that older buildings make, the shifting of timber, the murmuring of ancient plaster, but it startled him nonetheless. Not because it was loud, but because it came from the hallway, from the place where Marianne had stood the night before, holding Clara's drawing like a relic of betrayal. The memory of her face returned to him now, not angry, not wounded, just still, the kind of stillness that follows a long illness or precedes the moment a verdict is read aloud. He rose from the chair and opened the bureau drawer. Inside was a smaller notebook, older even than the journal Marianne had found. Within it lay notes, clippings, dates, letters never posted. A private archive of Clara's infancy, her first medical appointment, a record of the bank transfers made to Eliza Blake during the early months, all done quietly, discreetly, to avoid scandal, to preserve the image of a man on the path to respectability, as his father had once put it. But Eliza had vanished not long after Clara's first birthday. She had written once a single page, postmarked from a Devonshire town called Bickley, saying only that she could no longer carry the burden. There had been no accusation, no recrimination, just that one devastating line: "She is safer with him than with me." Jonathan had never spoken those words aloud, not even to himself, but now they rang in the quiet like a tolling bell. He turned the page, and there it was again, Edward's signature on the transfer of guardianship, legal, final, as cold as slate. It had been done with great haste and little ceremony, a necessary formality justified by their father's insistence on discretion. Eliza had signed too, her name slanted and faint, as though already withdrawing from the page. And yet there had always been doubts, whispers that Edward had taken not just custody but control, that he had raised the child not as a niece but as a ward of his doctrine, his books, his austere disciplines, his vision of truth, purified by silence. Edward had once told him with frightening calm that Clara would transcend the narrative of parentage. Jonathan, who had spent years trying to forget, now saw that forgetting had never been a luxury, it had been a choice born of cowardice. There was a creak on the stair. He turned swiftly. Marianne stood at the threshold, still in her robe, though her face was composed and dry. In her hands, she held the silver chain, the one from the box, and the letter from Edward, the one with the wax seal. I read it, she said, her voice low but clear. The letter, all of it. Jonathan said nothing. There was no need. Her presence in the study, robe-clad and barefoot, had more authority than any reprimand. She isn't missing, Marianne said quietly. She's watching. Her eyes moved to the window, though there was nothing to see but the garden and the old walnut tree. Then she placed the chain gently on the bureau and added, "You must stop writing to ghosts, Jonathan. They have heard enough." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw, not the woman he had failed, but the woman who had endured, the one who had lived through his silences and carried her own sorrows without ever asking for restitution. "I'm afraid," he said at last, voice hoarse. "I know," she replied, "but what you fear isn't her, it's yourself and what you allowed to grow in your absence." With that, she turned and left him once more, her footsteps barely audible on the wooden floor. Jonathan returned to the window. The wind had dropped, and the world outside lay in that peculiar stillness, peculiar to midwinter afternoons, the kind that belongs to gravesides and empty cathedrals. And yet somewhere beyond the hedgerows, beyond the fading memory of his brother's voice, and the uncertain promise of a daughter not quite known, something moved, not in malice, not in mercy, but in inevitability. He closed the journal, placed the silver chain on top, and whispered to no one at all, then let her come. The hour was just before dusk when Jonathan found himself again on the road north, the sky above the Wiltshire fields, bleeding slowly into a quiet lavender dusk. It was not a journey made in haste, nor one made with the conviction of purpose. Rather, it was a pilgrimage of uncertainty, undertaken not for penance nor reconciliation, but for the possibility of contact. A thread of invisible tension had begun to draw him towards the place Edward had once kept. Most secret, a retreat near the edge of Exmoor, where he had, according to old letters and half-remembered conversations, spent the later years of his life. The road wound narrow and steep past ancient hedgerows and the occasional tumble of dry stone wall. The trees leaned low here, older than any nearby homestead, their roots gnarled like the knuckles of forgotten labourers. Somewhere between Dulverton and Winsford, Jonathan came upon a sign faded almost beyond reading St. Cuthbert's Retreat, by appointment only. He turned onto the path, more mud than gravel, and followed it to the edge of a clearing where the retreat stood less a building than a remnant. The structure was modest timber and flint moss crawling up its southern side, once a rectory, perhaps now repurposed for spiritual rest. The air around it was so still that even the birdsong seemed reluctant to intrude. At its threshold stood a man in a charcoal robe, tall, pale of complexion, his hair clipped short and grey at the temples. He greeted Jonathan with a nod as though expecting him. "You've come for the girl," the man said without introduction. Jonathan stiffened. "I've come to know whether she is here." The monk or retreat master perhaps offered no smile, no gesture of welcome, only turned and walked inside. "Then you had better follow." The entryway smelled of sandalwood and cold stone. A candle burned beside a wooden basin filled with river water, and above it hung a faded scroll with Japanese calligraphy, one Jonathan could not read, though the characters gave an impression of wind crossing water. They passed through a narrow corridor into a small cloister, where the monk finally paused. "She is not here," he said quietly. Jonathan exhaled, though the news brought no relief. "But she has been." "How recently?" Jonathan asked. The monk met his eyes. 3 weeks past. She said nothing of her origin, but we knew. Jonathan's brows furrowed. You knew? She bore the mark, the monk replied, drawing his hand to his own chest. The sigil your brother carved on his walking staff. He left it here years ago with strict instructions. She came, saw it and said only, "He has not been erased." Then she departed. Jonathan sat heavily on a nearby bench. The cloister was cool, the stone beneath him unforgiving. The idea that Clara had walked these same flagstones so recently in silence sent a tremor through him. Her arrival had not been fanfare but ritual, a silent visitation, a rite observed. "Did she speak of me?" he asked, though his voice barely rose above the candle flame. The monk gave a slow, grave shake of the head. She asked for the chamber her guardian once kept. She read his journals. She refused tea, refused rest. She stayed one night only. Jonathan's gaze shifted to the far wall, where a faded mural depicted Saint Cuthbert among ravens and sea beasts, eyes turned upward, as though toward the judgment of heaven. The old stories said he had fled men and lived among seals. What was she seeking? Jonathan whispered. The monk sat beside him. His voice when he spoke was reverent, slow as though delivering sacred instruction. Your daughter did not come in pursuit of answers, Mr. Wren. She came to observe a silence. The kind one keeps not out of ignorance, but reverence, and the kind that precedes speech of great consequence. Jonathan nodded slowly. He began to understand. Clara was not hunting lineage or apology. She was orbiting something larger, perhaps justice, perhaps transformation. The monk rose. "I have something that may be of use to you." He returned shortly with a small wooden box bound in leather straps. When he opened it, Jonathan saw not papers or heirlooms, but a bundle of prayer beads, a scroll, and a dried sprig of ginkgo. He picked up the scroll. The ink was faded, but Edward's handwriting was unmistakable. "This was written the night before he died," the monk said. "He asked that it be given to his brother only when the daughter had come and gone." Jonathan's hands trembled as he unrolled it. The words within were brief, brittle, as wind-blown leaves. There is a window between silence and speech, between memory and presence. She lives in that window. Do not seek to drag her through it, only to keep the frame open. Jonathan closed the scroll. The message offered no instruction, only clarity. She was not to be claimed or returned to a name. She had become something else, an inheritor, not of blood, but of the path walked by Edward himself. The monk touched his shoulder gently. "She walks west." "Why?" "Because the sea receives all things," the monk answered, "and those who wish to let go must first touch its edge." Jonathan understood. She was heading for the coast, not to vanish, but to complete something. Some pilgrimage of the soul that Edward had once begun and perhaps failed to finish. He stood to leave but hesitated. Was she well? The monk did not answer immediately. When he did, it was with a weight that echoed in the chamber. She was not angry, but she was vast, as though she carried a forest within her. Jonathan stepped out into the fading light, the wind colder now, more insistent. The trees whispered not with threat, but with urgency. He looked toward the road and saw in the long shadow of the cloister's gate a single crow watching him. Its head tilted, not with fear, but recognition. She had passed this way, and she had left the silence intact. By the time Jonathan reached the coast, the sky had thickened into a bruised grey, heavy with the weight of a coming storm. The land fell away gently before him, sloping past hedgerows and crooked fences until it met the wild, restless edge of the sea. He had followed no map, only the monk's final words and an unspoken conviction in his chest. Something vast and immutable pulled at him, as if the land itself were urging him forward toward the boundary where all things met their end or transformation. The cliffs of Heartland Key stood jagged and grand, carved by centuries of wind and waves that obeyed no man's law. This was no place for ceremony or closure. It was a place where memory yielded to the primal order of nature. Jonathan parked the car at the upper lane and continued on foot, the cold wind pushing back the lapels of his coat and numbing the backs of his hands. Below, the waves smashed against the rocks in a fury that felt both eternal and fresh, as if this violence had begun only yesterday. There was no sign of Clara at first, no figure standing dramatically upon a promontory, no coat flapping like a flag. He walked along the cliff-top path, scanning the line where earth met sea, until he came to a stone bench half hidden by gorse. There she was, seated unmoving, alone. Clara wore a dark wool coat and leather boots dulled by salt and sand. Her hair, no longer pulled back, fell in loose waves that caught the light when the clouds parted. Her profile was calm, etched, with a kind of deliberate restraint, like the statues of mourning women found in old cathedrals. She did not turn to acknowledge him, though she must have sensed his approach. Jonathan stopped a few paces behind, not daring to close the distance too quickly. The wind carried the sound of seabirds and the hissing undertone of waves dragging stones back into the deep. "I wasn't certain you would come here," he said at last, his voice low, meant for her and the sea alone. Clara did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose with slow grace and turned. Her face was more refined than he remembered. In the photograph, older, yes, but still impossibly young for her years. There was a firmness in her gaze, not born of arrogance, but of something cultivated and ancient, as though she had long since ceased to measure time the way others did. "I didn't come for you," she said, and her voice was neither cold nor cruel, but precise, like a bell struck once and left to echo. "I know," Jonathan replied, "but I came for you." At that, a faint expression passed over her face. It was not quite surprise, perhaps recognition of what he could not say. "You were never meant to be hidden," he continued. "I see that now. I thought I believed what was done was to protect everyone, Eliza, myself, even Edward. But I see now that the protection was only for our illusions, not for you." She looked away then toward the horizon. The sea glittered like iron beneath the darkening sky, and a solitary gull wheeled overhead. "Uncle Edward taught me silence," she said, "but not the silence of secrecy, the silence of attention, of absence and presence. He said that words would come later, when they no longer needed to protect me." Jonathan stepped closer, though he still kept respectful distance. "Did he speak of me?" he asked. Clara nodded once, only once. "He said you ran away from your own kindness." The words pierced him more than any accusation. They had the weight of truth delivered without cruelty. He lowered his gaze. "I was a coward," he admitted, "not in the way of fleeing battles, but in the way of turning from responsibility. I saw it as shame. You were a child born of, well, of a time. I tried to forget. But you were not shame. You were never that." Clara studied him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she moved to sit again on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, with a stillness that felt sacred. After a moment, Jonathan joined her. A short distance behind them, a small cottage stood nestled against the slope, roofed in slate windows shuttered. It had once been a way station for lighthouse keepers, now rarely used, except by walkers or those seeking solitude. Clara's gaze moved to it. "I stayed there last night," she said. "There's no electricity, just oil lamps and a kettle. I read one of his old books. He left one for me under the floorboard." Jonathan nodded. He always had a way of making plans without asking permission. She gave the faintest smile. It was there only for a heartbeat, but it was real. "I'm not here to find a father," she said, "or to accuse one. You don't owe me devotion." "No," Jonathan replied, "but I owe you acknowledgement, and perhaps space to speak, to choose." She looked at him then, truly looked, as if weighing him not against what he had been, but what he could yet become. Her brow furrowed slightly. "I've lived outside of stories," she said. "I've observed how people make cages from them. Family, nation, memory. I've chosen not to be part of that, not out of rebellion, but because I needed to see what remained when the narrative ended." Jonathan drew in a slow breath. "And what did you find?" She was quiet a moment. The wind stirred again, rustling the tall grass behind them. "Silence," she said, "but not emptiness." They sat there a while longer. No attempt was made to reconcile or embrace. They were not playing out a scene from one of Jonathan's old novels where estranged blood finds swift healing. Instead, they shared the space without trespass. Two souls who had inherited a wound that neither had inflicted. As the tide drew in, the sky began to bleed orange beneath the clouds, casting long, slanted light over the rocks below. Clara stood once more, brushed the wind from her hair, and turned inland. "I will leave tomorrow," she said. "There is a place beyond Bodmin I wish to visit. He once wrote of it, said it was the last place he dreamed before he stopped dreaming." Jonathan rose. "Will you let me drive you?" "No," she said, not unkindly, "but if I write, I'll send it to the old house. You're still there." "Yes." She hesitated, and Marianne. "She remains, with more dignity than I deserve." Clara nodded, and something softened in her eyes. She is the only name he praised without condition. Jonathan said nothing. He merely watched her descend the path toward the cottage, her figure steady, her steps unhurried. She did not look back. When she reached the door, she paused and raised a hand in farewell, not a wave, but a gesture of recognition. He returned it silently. And then she was gone. The gull returned, circling once, before it too vanished into the sea-bound dusk. Jonathan remained at the cliff top alone, not with regret, but with reverence. The past had not been healed. It had been witnessed. And in that witnessing, something like grace had passed between them. The following morning broke slowly over the rolling hills of North Devon, the mist lingering low across the fields, like the breath of a sleeping world. Jonathan awoke in the small inn where he had taken lodging the night before, its rooms fragrant with old timber and lavender soap. The window pane bore beads of condensation, and beyond it the trees swayed gently, as if murmuring secrets to one another beneath the breeze. He sat for some time in the quiet of the room, still dressed in yesterday's coat, his gaze fixed on the small stone chapel that stood opposite the inn. Its crooked bell tower and ivy-choked walls made it seem less like a place of worship and more like an artifact, something unearthed from a forgotten age. The villagers said the chapel had been closed for decades save for All Souls' Day, when the keeper of keys returned to light a single candle in memory of the lost. Jonathan considered this as he sipped the dark tea brought by the innkeeper's son, barely 16, rosy-cheeked and quick to vanish. He had reminded Jonathan faintly of a younger Edward, shy, precise yet with an unspoken boldness flickering beneath the surface like embers, waiting for the right breath of wind. A folded paper had been slipped beneath his door that morning, no name upon it, only a line scrawled in elegant hand. Where the hawthorn hides the stone, the root remembers. He recognized the phrasing. It was Edward's, and it was Clara's. The phrase struck him as both riddle and summons. The hawthorn, a tree of Old English lore, often used in burial grounds or at the edges of crossroads. The stone perhaps a marker, something hidden in plain sight. But it was the final part, the root remembers, that gnawed at his thoughts. Memory in Edward's world was never linear. It grew downward, inward, like roots curling into the soil of silence. After breakfast, he set off on foot, heading inland toward Bodmin Moor, guided by instinct and fragments of recollection. The village of Blyland lay nestled along the southern fringe, its cottages low and moss-laden, as if bowing to the weight of years. He had not been there since the early 2000s when he and Edward had visited during one of their rare reconciliations. Edward had spoken of a stone ring hidden deep among the gorse, older than the Roman roads, where the air tasted of first truths. Jonathan remembered dismissing the comment at the time as another of Edward's mystical tangents. Now, he retraced those steps with a reverence born of necessity. The moor opened wide and lonesome as he left the village behind. The sky overhead had cleared to a cold blue, and the wind tugged insistently at his coat as though warning him back. But he pressed on boots, sinking into the softened ground, until the horizon gave way to a circle of standing stones, not grand like Stonehenge, but modest and solitary, their surfaces worn with centuries of rain and lichen. He found the hawthorn tree to the north of the circle, its branches bare and clawed against the sky. Beneath it, half concealed by frost-bitten bracken, lay a flat stone no larger than a door tile. He knelt before it and saw carved faintly the same sigil Edward had etched into his staff, a crescent within a square, ancient in design. He placed his hand on it, and the earth beneath gave slightly, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside was a box, wooden lacquered black with iron hinges, and a clasp that bore Clara's name in tiny, meticulous engraving. He opened it with hesitant hands. Within lay a journal, not Edward's, not Clara's, but Eliza Blake's. The writing on the first page was unmistakably hers. It opened not with a greeting, but a confession. To the man I once called a mistake, know this, I never meant to vanish, I meant to preserve. The entries spanned several years from Clara's infancy, through the time just before her transfer to Edward's care. Each page was layered with guilt and defiance, sorrow and resolve. Eliza had not run from motherhood, not at first, but illness both of the body and spirit had claimed her. Depression had shadowed every day, and shame had followed her like a second skin. Edward had stepped in not as savior, but as steward, offering structure, philosophy, and silence. She wrote of Clara's early speech, her habit of listening before answering, and of the way she often stared at the moon as though deciphering some invisible code. The girl had been different, deliberate, exacting, strange, even to her mother. And then buried halfway through the journal, a passage that made Jonathan's breath still in his chest. Edward believed she was a vessel not for religion, but for stillness. He called it inherited quiet. I call it loneliness in disguise. Jonathan closed the book and sat back against the base of the hawthorn, the wind now calmer, the silence vast. The moor around him stretched endless, but for the call of a lone curlew in the distance. In this place, words felt heavy. Thoughts felt like seeds waiting for soil. The journal had not been left there for him to discover by chance. Clara had led him to it not out of malice or desire for reconciliation, but as a kind of right. He would not receive her story from her lips, nor through apology or confrontation. He would inherit it, curated, distilled, painful. And yet the inheritance was a gift. He sat there for what might have been an hour or several. The shadows of the stones lengthened, casting long fingers across the grass. He thought of Eliza then not as the ghost of a mistake, but as a woman who had endured a trial beyond reckoning. He remembered her laughter in the first months they had met back when he had been teaching part-time, and she worked behind the counter at a bookshop in Durham. She had never spoken loudly, but her eyes had always been vivid with curiosity. Her tragedy had not been madness. It had been the loneliness of carrying knowledge no one else was ready to hold. He took the journal, wrapped it in the cloth lining of the box, and placed both inside his satchel. As he stood, the clouds above began to close, again grey and solemn. The wind rose, rustling the hawthorn behind him, its branches creaking like a gate slowly opened. He turned toward the distant road, knowing it would be evening by the time he reached the inn. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would write to Marianne, not to explain everything, for that would take a lifetime, but to say only that he understood the shape of silence now and how it curved into every part of their lives. And somewhere, wherever Clara had gone next, she would know he had read it all. She would not ask for his reaction. That was not her way, but she would know. And that knowing would be enough. Jonathan returned to the village by twilight, his coat and boots speckled with the moor's damp soil and moss. The journal sat heavy in his satchel, not merely by weight, but by the burden it carried. The shadows of Eliza's past and Clara's fractured inheritance had taken root in him, now mingling with his own regrets and unspoken reckonings. There was no escaping the truth that he had, for most of her life, lived in the periphery of his daughter's existence, a ghostly presence defined more by absence than memory. He crossed the threshold of the inn and found Marianne seated alone by the hearth in the common room, her knitting needles paused, mid-stitch, her gaze flickering to the fire as though searching for meaning in its dance. She looked up as he entered, not startled nor expectant, but with the kind of quiet regard reserved for old companions who have learned the virtue of patient silence. "You're late," she said softly, setting the yarn aside. "There was more to find than I anticipated," he replied, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. The warmth from the fire reached into his bones, a welcome balm after the windswept walk. She studied him for a long moment. "You've read something, haven't you?" He nodded and withdrew the journal from his bag, laying it gently on the small table between them. "Eliza's," he said, "left for Clara, but meant for me too, I think." Marianne's hand hovered above the cover, then drew back, uncertain whether she had permission to touch it. "You should read it," he said, his voice more invitation than command. "It speaks of things I never understood, about her, about Edward, about all of us, really." Marianne hesitated, then closed her hand around a cup of tea she had earlier poured and not yet touched. There was always a certain Reticence in Edward, she said, looking into the steam. Even when he smiled, it was as though he were holding something back. I used to think it was arrogance, but now I suspect it was simply pain carried too long without name or witness. Jonathan felt the weight of those words settle in him. Marianne had known Edward once briefly and awkwardly. A single dinner at Cambridge in their student days, followed by an estrangement that never found resolution. It had always lingered between them, unspoken but not forgotten. He protected Clara, Jonathan said, but he also shaped her into something I can't quite grasp. She speaks with silence, if that makes any sense. It does, Marianne replied. Some silences are not absence. They're scaffolds, structures of discipline built to contain grief. He gave her a long, steady look. You've always seen deeper than I gave you credit for. She smiled faintly. You only see what you're prepared to bear, Jonathan. We both know that. He leaned back in his chair, the fire reflecting in his eyes. I keep wondering what my place is now. She doesn't need me. Not in the way daughters are supposed to need their fathers. And yet, I feel as though I've been called, summoned almost. Not to rescue, but to bear witness, to acknowledge. Marianne reached across the table, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment. Then do so, she said, without expectation of reward, without demand. Let her see you standing still when the wind rises. They fell into silence, the kind that was not awkward but sacred. Outside, the wind whispered through the hedgerows and the inn's walls creaked softly in the shifting temperatures of dusk. Somewhere beyond those walls, Clara continued her quiet pilgrimage. The next morning, Jonathan walked alone to the chapel across the lane. Its door was rusted shut, but the side entrance remained passable. Within, the stone pews sat in obedient rows beneath a wooden ceiling darkened by time. Dust clung to the windows, filtering the light into muted rays that spilled across the floor like blessings fallen from disuse. He moved slowly toward the altar, where a single candle had been left unlit beside a narrow vase of dried lavender. He did not pray, he hadn't in years, but he stood with the stillness of one who recognizes the sanctity of restraint. He thought of Clara's phrase, inherited quiet. He had always feared silence. It reminded him of failure, of emotional vacancy. But now it had begun to seem like a form of transmission, an unspoken inheritance passed from Edward to Clara, and perhaps even now to him. Upon the chapel wall hung an old memorial plaque, the brass dulled with age. It bore the names of men lost in the Great War. Among them was a Jonathan Wren, a distant ancestor perhaps, or a coincidence. But something in that echo touched him. Names repeated, lives, half-known fates intersecting across generations. As he stood there, he felt the faintest shift in the air behind him. Turning, he found Marianne in the doorway. She said nothing, only raised her eyes to meet his. "There's someone outside," she said at last. "She's come." Jonathan followed her out. The morning had cleared, sky bright and full of the pale promise of winter. At the gate of the chapel stood Clara. She looked different now, older somehow, though only days had passed. Her coat was flecked with rain, her boots worn from the road. She held nothing in her hands, not even a satchel. She had come stripped of luggage, as if to meet not her father but her name. Jonathan stopped a few feet away. Marianne held back, sensing this moment was not hers. Clara regarded him. Her eyes held no accusation, but neither did they yield affection. What passed between them was something deeper, a recognition of shared origin and divergent path. "I wanted to see the chapel," she said. "Of course," Jonathan replied. "It's open though seldom used." She nodded. Edward spoke of it once, said it reminded him of a place in Kyoto, not for worship but for listening. Jonathan gestured gently toward the doorway. Then, let it speak. She passed him, pausing briefly, as if to weigh his scent, his nearness, the shape of a father she had never known in youth. Inside she moved slowly, her steps deliberate. She touched nothing, she lit no candle, but she stood a long time before the altar, her posture straight, her breath steady. Jonathan did not follow. He remained by the entrance, watching her not as one who seeks to reclaim, but as one who knows he was never entitled to possession. When she emerged again, the sun had risen further, casting her in the warm glow of early light. She looked at him, then truly looked, and for the first time, her face softened. "I will not stay," she said. "I know," he answered, "but I will write." He nodded. She glanced once toward Marianne, offering a respectful inclination of her head, then turned down the lane without another word. Jonathan stood until her figure vanished beyond the hedgerow. In his chest, he did not feel pride, nor loss, nor triumph. He felt only this, that the silence he had once feared now housed a life's worth of meaning. And that was enough. The days that followed Clara's departure unfolded like a slow-turning clock, each tick a reminder of absence, each chime a distant echo of words unsaid. Jonathan remained in the village, finding himself reluctant to return to London. The city, once a shelter from memory, now seemed ill-fitted to the newfound quiet that had begun to inhabit him. Instead, he took to walking the fields and lanes surrounding the inn, his boots carving habitual paths through the frost-bitten soil. It was late November, and the hedgerows were bare save for the stubborn red of hawthorn berries. Crows nested noisily in the sycamores by the churchyard, and the scent of peat fires lingered over the cottages like a reminder that winter was near. Marianne had returned to her home in Totnes, promising to write should anything arise. She left behind a half-filled basket of sloe gin, dried thyme, and a small carved hare, her way of saying goodbye without ceremony. Jonathan placed it on the mantel above the hearth, where the hare's carved eyes seemed to watch over the room with quiet diligence. One morning, as the innkeeper's boy brought him tea, he handed Jonathan an envelope. No stamp, no address, only a name written in block letters. J. Wren. Inside was a letter composed in the same firm, elegant hand that had penned the journal entry. "I have returned to the place where Edward raised me. The monastery has changed little. The winter wind still carves its voice through the stones. I've taken a role in the library here, sorting, archiving, reading what was left behind. The monks remember you, some with affection, some with curiosity. I remember you with neither, but I do remember. This is not reconciliation, it is recognition. That is what matters now. See." There was no sign-off, no mention of Eliza, no invitation to reply, and yet the words struck Jonathan as more generous than any embrace. Clara had offered him a place, not in her life perhaps, but in her memory. That alone he knew was a rare grace. He folded the letter and placed it inside the back of Eliza's journal, which remained on his nightstand. He had read it twice more since discovering it beneath the hawthorn tree, each time gleaning new meaning from the ink and pain of its entries. There was one passage in particular that lingered with him, penned during the waning months of Eliza's illness. "We cannot undo what we bury, but we can choose where we plant remembrance." It was in that spirit that Jonathan chose to visit the library in Torquay. Not the one run by the council, but the old ecclesiastical archive attached to the ruins of St. Alcuin's Abbey, where Edward had once sent him a letter scrawled across the margins of a monk's sermon. The abbey had fallen out of religious use decades prior, but the library remained open to scholars and those seeking historical clarity, people Jonathan supposed like himself. He arrived on a Thursday morning, the air dense with salt from the nearby sea. The library's stone facade was austere, weathered by years of brine and wind, but its wooden doors had been freshly oiled. Within, the walls were lined with ancient texts and annotated scrolls, some rolled tightly, others resting like sleeping relics. A woman named Agnes greeted him, tall, grey-haired, and dressed in a woolen shawl that smelled faintly of sandalwood. "I remember Edward," she said, without preamble, as she guided him toward a reading alcove. He preferred not to speak, but his eyes read everything. Jonathan offered a faint smile. "That sounds like him." Agnes led him to a table near a narrow window. "You'll want the monastic diaries from the 80s and 90s. That's when he left his strongest imprint." Jonathan spent the better part of the day combing through the volumes. Among the faded ink and marginalia, he found several entries written by the monastery's prior, at the time Brother Aldwin. They described Edward as a man of discipline, contemplation, and a troubling kind of detachment. There were references to his teachings on silence on the inward path, and notably on the concept of the witnessed self, the notion that identity was less about possession and more about observation. That a person became real, not by asserting, but by being seen with clarity and without judgment. It struck Jonathan then that Edward had not raised Clara to resemble himself, but to become a mirror. She had learned to reflect the world around her with painful accuracy, and in doing so to unsettle those who dared to look too long. That was her gift, and perhaps her burden. He closed the diary gently and rested his hands upon its worn leather cover. The library was nearly empty now, save for Agnes at the far end, dusting the edges of a tall shelf with careful reverence. "Did you ever speak with him?" Jonathan asked when she returned. "Once," she replied. "He asked me whether the purpose of the archive was to preserve truth or to delay its decay." "And what did you say?" "I told him that truth doesn't need preservation. Only people do." That evening, Jonathan walked along the Torquay promenade, the wind brisk and sharp with the scent of the channel. He watched the waves heave against the stones below, their rhythm, eternal and indifferent. The lamplight cast a golden sheen upon the path, and couples passed him arm in arm, whispering into the twilight. He thought of Eliza then, of her hands always half-inked from the typewriter, and of her lullabies which had often been fragments of Latin hymns or forgotten nursery rhymes. He thought of her decision to relinquish Clara, not as abandonment, but as a final attempt to preserve her daughter's essence. There had been love in that choice, however, misshapen. The moon rose over the horizon like a solemn witness. Beneath its light, Jonathan made a silent vow not to chase Clara down, not to demand anything of her, but to remain where he was faithful to stillness, prepared to receive whatever was offered. Back at the inn, he unpacked a single book he had borrowed from the library, a collection of Zen koans annotated by Edward. Tucked between the pages was a small pressed leaf of ginkgo, fragile and golden, like a prayer flattened by time. He placed it upon the windowsill beside the hair where the evening breeze stirred it gently, as if even now the world still whispered in parables. Jonathan sat by the hearth, the fire low and glowing, and wrote a letter with no addressee. To the one who remembers in silence, I remain. In stillness, in watching in the unfinished thread of our bloodline, I do not seek to be known, but I am no longer afraid of being seen. He did not seal it, nor post it. Some letters, like some prayers, are meant only for the wind. Rain had returned to the moors, not in violent bursts, but in a persistent fine mist that softened every edge it touched. It made the hedgerows droop under its weight and turned the footpaths into winding trails of mud and moss. Jonathan had always disliked this sort of weather, in his younger years melancholy, without thunder grey, without drama. Yet now it suited him. It mirrored the inward mood that had settled upon him like an old coat. He remained in the village, postponing his return to London once again. The city had grown distant in his thoughts, a place of worn-out purpose and indifferent noise. Here, in this quiet corner of Devonshire, time seemed to bend in subtle ways. The days passed, not with deadlines or demands, but with the turning of the clouds, the shifting of light upon stone. It was during one such drizzling morning that the past arrived again, not as memory, but as flesh. Jonathan had wandered into the churchyard to visit the grave of Reverend Tolland, a man who had once baptized Clara, though she never knew it. The stone was modest, tucked between two larger monuments, its inscription barely visible through the lichen. As he knelt to brush the moss from the letters, a voice sounded behind him, low, gravelly, shaped by pipe smoke and northern winters. "So you came back." Jonathan turned, squinting through the mist. A man stood at the edge of the yew tree, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf, holding a walking stick that looked more ceremonial than necessary. His hair was white and full, his eyebrows thick with unspoken judgment. It was Reverend Miles Ainsworth. "I thought you were still in York," Jonathan said, rising slowly. "They buried my sister here last week. I came to see to her affairs, but I heard whispers you were about." His eyes narrowed. I couldn't quite believe it. Jonathan nodded, not as a greeting, but as a form of surrender. Ainsworth had been Edward's tutor and moral advisor, once a sharp-tongued man of scripture, now an aged custodian of unrepentant truths. "You look older," Ainsworth remarked. "But then again, don't we all?" "We do," Jonathan replied evenly. "Some of us age from the outside in, others the reverse." Ainsworth regarded him for a moment, then walked past the yew tree and sat on the low stone bench facing the chapel. His coat shed beads of rain like a shield. "I presume you've seen her," he said. "Yes." "She's like Edward." "She is," Jonathan replied, though his tone carried complexities not easily named. Ainsworth nodded grimly. He raised her as one would raise a question to be asked again and again, never to be answered. There was a pause, filled only by the patter of mist on leaves. "Do you remember the lantern service?" Ainsworth asked suddenly. Jonathan did. It had been the winter after Clara's birth. The villagers had gathered at the chapel on Solstice Eve, each holding a small lantern carved with symbols, stars, lambs, doves. The light procession through the fields had been meant as a quiet resistance against the darkness, both seasonal and spiritual. Edward had stood beside him that night, uncharacteristically moved. He said that night was the only one in which he felt truly seen, Jonathan murmured. Ainsworth gave a rare, slow nod. He wept afterward. "Not publicly, of course, but I found him in the vestry," he said. "He feared the light more than the dark, because light required him to face things." Jonathan looked away. He feared himself, perhaps. "As do we all," Ainsworth replied, tapping his cane once against the stone. "But you, what is it you fear now, Jonathan?" The question was not an attack. It was offered plainly like a cup of bitter tea. Jonathan considered it, his eyes falling upon the Reverend's weathered hands. "That I'll outlive all this," he said finally. "That I'll carry these unfinished threads, and no one will ask me to tie them off. That silence will not be peace, but obscurity." Ainsworth stood, his joints stiff with cold. "Then write," he said. "Not for them, not even for her, but for the sake of recording. What is not written dissolves." He offered no farewell, only the sharp scrape of his cane against the gravel as he disappeared into the fog. Jonathan returned to the inn with the heaviness of that counsel pressing upon him. He did not light a fire. Instead, he fetched Eliza's journal once more and laid it open upon the table beside a fresh sheet of paper. He began to write not a letter, not a confession, but an account, a tracing of lines half forgotten, a reweaving of the thread Edward had spun. He wrote of the house in Dorking, where he and Eliza had once argued over names for a child they would never keep. He described the tree behind the vicarage, where Clara had hidden as a child, and Edward had once watched her for hours, neither of them speaking. He recalled Marianne's quiet grief at knowing too much, and Reverend Tolland's whispered doubt that sometimes faith required stepping backward. He wrote until dusk blurred the ink and his fingers cramped from effort. Only then did he rest. That night, a dream came to him, vivid and persistent. He stood once again in the lantern field, the grass crackling with frost, his hands cupping a small wooden light. Clara was beside him, not as she was now, but as a child, wide-eyed, solemn, and unafraid. They did not speak. They simply walked their lanterns, swaying in time with one another. When he awoke, the fire had burned low. Outside, the mist had cleared, revealing a crisp blue morning. He made tea and placed the journal, the new pages, and the pressed ginkgo leaf inside a tin box, the sort used for old photographs and war medals. He fastened it shut and placed it atop the mantel beside Marianne's carved hair. He did not intend to send it anywhere, not yet, but he had preserved something, a shape in the fog, a record against forgetting. And in that act alone, something inside him grew quiet, not erased, not resolved, but still and waiting. The year turned once more, and the first true frost of December came suddenly, drawing white breath from the hedgerows and sheathing the village roofs with a quiet gleam. The wind had acquired that peculiar edge only known in the final days before Christmas. Cold, not merely in temperature, but in memory, capable of stirring things left buried under seasons of silence. Jonathan Wren awoke before dawn that morning, the window panes veiled with rime. The inn had grown quieter since the tourists departed for the cities, and even the postman now came less frequently. His days passed with a peculiar stillness, broken only by the kettle's whistle or the occasional bark of the innkeeper's terrier, scolding shadows that no one else could see. He had not heard from Clara again since her note, nor from Marianne. He did not expect to. What had passed between them belonged to a realm untouched by custom or correspondence. But something had shifted nonetheless. In the marrow of his days, a new rhythm was taking hold, as if the silence itself had begun to speak in subtler tones. That morning, Jonathan walked toward the marshes at the village's southern edge, a place where few ventured in winter. The path there was narrow and half-eaten by brambles, the reeds grown tall and brittle. Beyond lay a low causeway of stone and ash remnants of an ancient Roman road, that once connected two forgotten forts. The locals called it the spine, for it lay bare like the back of some slumbering beast indifferent to age or ownership. Jonathan had not walked that path since before Eliza's death. It had been her favorite place during her final weeks, when the doctor's visits became more frequent and conversation had given way to shared silence. She would sit on the old bench by the reed pond, watching the herons step like monks across the shallows, their long beaks pointing toward nothing and everything. He found the bench still standing, though the wood had split in places, and ivy was beginning to take it back. He brushed away a patch of moss and sat drawing his coat closer. The stillness of the marsh had a peculiar dignity. No birds sang. The air smelled faintly of peat and frozen algae. It was here, of all places, that he remembered a tale Eliza had once told him something from her school days. There was a girl, she'd said, who lived near a bell tower that had never rung. People said it was cursed, or perhaps forgotten by time. But one night during a thunderstorm, she claimed she heard the bell toll not loud but unmistakable. The next morning she vanished. Some say she entered the tower and never left. Others say she became the sound itself, an echo that needed no walls. Jonathan had not thought of that story in years. It struck him now as both nonsensical and profound, a metaphor perhaps for people like Edward, or like Clara, or even himself, those whose presence resounded not in conversation or celebration, but in absence, in aftermath. He sat there a long while, the frost biting at his boots. Then, with a strange resolve, he rose and began walking not back toward the village, but farther into the marshland. The spine ran on for nearly 2 miles, ending at a low hill, crowned by the remnants of a Roman watchtower, just a few stones and a broken arch, but visible from miles around. Halfway there, he was met by an unexpected figure. A child, no older than 10, stood by the path, tugging at a string tied around a paper kite. It was a strange thing to see in winter, a kite with no wind, yet the boy held it aloft with great care, as though trying to summon something invisible into being. "Good morning," Jonathan said, unsure whether the child was real. The boy looked up, his eyes, dark and wide, but did not speak. Instead, he pointed toward the hill. "There's a girl up there," he said quietly. Jonathan followed the gesture. "What girl?" "She doesn't talk much, but she's waiting." "For whom?" The boy shrugged. "Someone who remembers her." And then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the reeds. Jonathan, feeling the full weight of uncertainty press upon his chest, continued walking. His boots cracked the thin sheets of ice that lay between grass and sky, and the air grew sharper with every step. At the hilltop he found no one, only the ruins and the wind moving in slow circles as though unsure which direction to take. He approached the stones and leaned against the arch, catching his breath. And then he saw it. Carved into the rock, weathered but unmistakable, was a name. Elisa. It was not elaborate nor deep, a child's hand perhaps, or an old one trembling with purpose. Beneath it, in smaller letters, "We return not to finish, but to begin again." He traced the letters with a gloved finger. The stone was cold and pitted, yet the act of tracing brought a strange warmth to his chest, as though some ember of forgotten belonging had been reignited. He stood there until the clouds broke and a shaft of sunlight pierced the marsh. It caught the frost on the reeds and turned them momentarily to glass. The whole landscape glittered with the brief illusion of gold. As he descended the hill, he no longer felt alone. The wind did not seem hostile. The marsh did not feel empty. It felt instead like a library, ancient, wordless, and waiting. By the time he returned to the village, the afternoon light was already waning. He stopped by the post office, collected a small parcel, addressed in neat handwriting. Inside was a single item, a pocket compass. No note, no explanation. It bore one scratch on the glass face running diagonally across the needle, yet it still pointed north. He held it a moment, letting it rest in his palm. Then he placed it in his coat and walked home. That evening he lit a candle rather than the fire. Its flicker cast long shadows on the walls, and the carved hair beside the ginkgo leaf looked almost animate. He opened Eliza's journal once more now, nearly full with his own additions, and in the margin of the last page, he wrote a single line. Memory is not the past reaching back, but the soul moving forward. Then he closed the book not as an ending, but as a breath drawn in before the next word. The village square bore the silence of a Sunday morning, untouched by bells. Winter had settled with more conviction now, cloaking hedges and chimneys in hoar frost, and turning the lane edges into ribbons of white lace. It was in such cold clarity that Jonathan Wren found himself walking toward the parish hall, a battered satchel swinging softly against his side, its contents the only weight he had left to bear. Inside the hall, dust motes turned like faint spirits beneath the tall windows. The building had once been a schoolhouse, in the days when children still laughed on the village. Green and men in broad hats read aloud from wooden pulpits. Now it served as a space for occasional gatherings, harvest suppers, and as fate would have it, reckonings. Clara was already there, seated alone at the far end of the hall. She wore a navy wool coat, her dark hair pinned back in a way that echoed Eliza's younger years, though there was something sterner, more composed in Clara's bearing. She did not rise as Jonathan entered, nor did he expect her to. He stopped halfway down the aisle beside the old lectern, with its polished brass plate bearing the name of Reverend Ainsworth's predecessor. His fingers tightened slightly on the satchel's worn strap. Clara's gaze remained steady. "You brought it," she said. "Yes," Jonathan replied, his voice gentler than it had been in many weeks. "I wasn't certain you'd come." She lifted her chin. "Neither was I." There was no need for elaborate greetings. They had passed that stage. Their relationship, whatever it might now become, had already been tempered by fire and shaped by the long, cool hours of distance. The silence between them was not fragile. It bore weight. It carried meaning. Jonathan approached slowly, drawing the satchel before him. With deliberate care, he opened it and removed the tin box, the same that had once held medals and pressed leaves, now burdened with letters, pages, and remnants of memory. He set it upon the table and stepped back. Clara did not touch it. Instead, she asked, "Did you read them all?" "I did." "And do you believe them?" Jonathan's eyes drifted toward the window, where frost traced delicate fractals on the leaded panes. "Belief," he said quietly, "has become a more nuanced thing with age." Clara rose and walked to the box. She opened the lid, but did not sift through its contents. Her fingers hovered just above the top letter, as though afraid that touching it might dissolve something essential. She said, "My uncle was not a cruel man, but he could be unyielding." Jonathan nodded slowly. Edward lived by a strict code. one that left little room for grace even toward himself. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, the edge in her gaze softened. "Did you love him?" The question landed with unexpected force. Jonathan did not flinch, but the air between them thickened. He replied, not hurriedly, but with a clarity born of long reflection. "Yes, in the way that men sometimes love their own shadows, with admiration, with resentment, with the knowledge that one cannot live without acknowledging the other." Clara's hand at last touched the journal, Eliza's journal, now heavy with additions penned by Jonathan's own hand. She withdrew it gently and held it close to her chest. "And my mother?" Jonathan's voice caught slightly. "Eliza was the pulse beneath my silence, the unspoken hymn in every moment I considered leaving and every moment I stayed." Clara took a breath slow and considered, "Did she ever ask for me?" Jonathan's response was not immediate. He searched her face, looking not for innocence but for readiness. "She asked if I remembered you. That was her way, not direct, but deeply felt. She said you had your father's eyes, but your own stillness." Clara closed the journal and placed it back into the box. The light through the window shifted briefly, catching the brass plate behind the lectern. The dust danced in recognition, like fading applause. "I came here thinking I wanted to confront you," Clara said, "to break whatever remains of this family's legacy. But now—" She did not finish the sentence. She turned, walking slowly back to the table and sitting once more. Her hands rested on her lap, her posture no longer rigid but grounded. Jonathan joined her at the table. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of the hall's old clock echoed like a slow heartbeat. "There was once a man," he said at last, "who carved ships in bottles. Not for profit nor praise, but because he believed that containment brought clarity, that the ship encased preserved not only its structure, but its purpose." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And did it?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but eventually the glass would cloud, the water would still, and the ship would become a relic, not a vessel." She understood. It was not forgiveness he sought, nor even understanding. It was motion, a movement beyond the fixed tableau of the past. "I won't stay in the village," she said quietly. "You shouldn't. But I'll write, eventually." He nodded. "That is enough." The air between them was no longer brittle. It had taken on the quality of wood smoke, faint, lingering, and oddly comforting. As they rose and made their way toward the door, the sound of church bells in the distance, unexpected on such a day, floated into the hall. It was not a peal of celebration, but something more reflective. A tolling for the hour, perhaps, or a memory choosing to sing itself once more before the year turned anew. They stepped outside together. The sky was the soft blue of porcelain. The path ahead, though icy, glinted with the promise of sun. Neither looked back. Whatever had been broken was not mended, but it was named, and naming at times was its own form of grace. The evening had settled upon the moorlands with a quiet majesty, and the wind moved across the heath like a slow-breathing creature, brushing through the gorse and heather with solemn grace. Clara Wren stood at the edge of Blackwater Tarn, her figure upright but still, her reflection softening across the glassy surface. This was a place her mother had once spoken of, in half-finished sentences, a place known only to those who sought retreat rather than refuge. It was not marked on maps. The villagers spoke of it sparingly, as one might of old graves or hidden wells. She had arrived that morning by foot, following paths unpaved and interrupted by bramble and stone. The old boots on her feet were worn through at the soles, and the hem of her woolen skirt was dark with dew and peat stain. She had not spoken since the hour before sunrise. Speech, she felt, had begun to weigh too heavily on the air. Silence, in contrast, offered passage. Behind her, no more than a quarter-mile off, stood the last vestiges of what had once been an abbey, a crumbling shell of grey limestone and ivy-bound arches, its cloister reduced to moss and sparrows. No monks had prayed there for centuries, yet the sanctity had not fled. It remained imbued into the very lichen breathing with the fog. Clara knelt by the water's edge, drawing out from beneath her cloak a small bundle wrapped in linen. With reverence, she unwrapped it, a slender wooden box, its surface carved with a single motif, a tree of 7 branches. It had belonged to Edward. It had passed to Jonathan, and now by quiet succession it was hers. She did not open it. Instead, she set it beside a flat stone and turned her gaze westward. The sun had begun to sink behind the line of hills, casting a mellow light that caught the tops of the firs and lit them like fire without heat. A heron lifted from the reeds across the tarn and glided silently toward the deeper woods. For a long time she remained as such, her posture unmoving, her breath shallow but steady. She was not waiting for a sign, nor for visitation. She had begun to understand that the most profound revelations came not through noise or spectacle, but through the slow and almost imperceptible alignment of the soul with its shadow. From behind the curve of the land, the sound of footsteps broke, the stillness not hurried but purposeful. Clara rose but did not turn. The footsteps halted. Then came the voice, familiar though rasped by the journey. "I wondered if you would come this far." It was Reverend Ainsworth. Clara's lips curved with the ghost of a smile. "And I wondered if you would follow." He stepped beside her, his clerical coat dusted with pale soil, his walking stick stained from the peat. His beard, once chestnut, had turned silver with the years, but his eyes retained their brightness, the glint of a man who still read poetry by candlelight. "You've traced your mother's path quite faithfully," he said, "perhaps even farther." Clara's gaze lingered on the horizon. "It is not her steps I follow, nor Edward's. It is the silence between them that draws me." Ainsworth nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "When your mother came here, she left behind no diary, no confession, only a pressed fern in the guest book and a quotation from the Tao." Clara raised her eyebrows slightly. What was the line? He smiled gently. "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." A gust of wind swept over the water, lifting the edges of Clara's cloak and sending ripples through the tarn's surface. The reflection of the sky fractured, and in its distortion lay something profound, a reminder that clarity does not always accompany truth. "Jonathan is leaving for Oxford," Ainsworth offered after a time. "He said he would not write unless you wished him to." "I know," Clara said. "It is better this way for now." "He hoped you would visit Eliza's grave before the thaw." Clara looked down at the box beside her foot. "I will, but not today." They stood in silence. The dusk deepened, drawing violet hues into the hollows of the hills. A pair of deer moved through the trees beyond their silhouettes, delicate and watchful. All creatures, Clara thought, carried within them a memory of stillness, though few remembered how to return to it. Ainsworth at last spoke. "May I ask, what do you intend to do?" Clara knelt once more and brushed a hand across the stone beside her. I intend to remain here for a while, to listen, to unlearn. He watched her eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment but contemplation. I had thought, he murmured, that you might take the path of your uncle. His was a life of withdrawal. She shook her head. Edward withdrew because he feared the weight of the world's contradictions. I remain because I wish to feel them fully, to hold them in the palm of my hand without flinching. Ainsworth nodded slowly. Then you are braver than either of them. Clara did not answer. She reached for the wooden box and opened it. Inside were only 3 things: a strand of her mother's hair bound in silk thread, a page from Edward's final journal marked with red ink, and a small stone polished smooth, etched with a single word: continuere. She set the box into a shallow crevice between the stones and placed a smooth, flat rock atop it. It is not burial, she said, only placement. The past should not be hidden, but it must be allowed to rest. The Reverend stepped back, allowing her space. Clara stood once more, brushing the earth from her skirt. She looked toward the path that curved away into the forest, and beyond that toward the villages she had yet to walk, through the strangers she had yet to meet, the silences she had yet to enter. And as she turned from the tarn, her steps did not falter. They were not heavy nor hesitant. They bore the steadiness of one who had made peace, not with all things, but with the truth that peace is not owed, only found. Behind her, the last light of the day gilded the surface of the water, and the hills stood, as they had for centuries, watchful, unmoved, and vast. The bells of St. Mary's tolled softly in the far distance, carried upon the breeze like the murmuring of a remembered hymn. Morning had unfolded with a pale luminescence, the kind that clung to the edges of the fields and rooftops, hesitating before it declared itself fully day. Clara Wren stood on the threshold of the parsonage library, a place long forgotten by parishioners and even longer ignored by the clergy who came and went with the decades. She pushed open the old oaken door with the heel of her palm. The hinges groaned but did not resist. Dust lifted in delicate spirals from the floorboards, stirred by her presence like spirits waking from slumber. The interior was untouched, since the vicar who came before Ainsworth, Reverend Blythe, had passed without a successor to claim the space. Sunlight diffused through leaded glass, fell across long disordered shelves and ancient pews repurposed as reading benches. The room was both sanctuary and sepulchre. She had returned not out of compulsion, but completion. Clara moved with measured grace, trailing her fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes whose titles had long faded into obscurity. Her heart was not burdened, but it was full-brimmed with the weight of things left unsaid and the grace of those accepted without explanation. On a narrow table near the hearth beneath a lace coverlet yellowed by time, she found what she had hoped for, the satchel her mother once carried in the year before she disappeared. Clara unfastened the clasp. Within lay her mother's sketchbook, the pages brittle but intact. Charcoal sketches of the abbey, ruins, the village green, the very tarn where Clara had laid Edward's keepsake to rest. One page bore a drawing of a face, Reverend Ainsworth's younger eyes full of solemnity. Clara seated herself and turned the pages with the tenderness of one handling relics. The final leaf was blank, but for a single sentence written in her mother's deliberate script: "He who walks the edge of silence finds not loneliness, but language of the soul." She remained there for an hour, perhaps 2, until the sunlight had tilted enough to catch the spines of the old psalters in gold, Then, folding the book into her own satchel, she rose and stepped out into the yard. At the edge of the path, Jonathan stood waiting. He wore a traveller's coat and boots thick with dried clay. His pack slung over his back had the wear of many roads. Yet in his bearing there was no urgency, only readiness, the calm resolve of one who had seen distance not as escape but as passage. Clara approached him slowly. She said nothing at first. "I thought I might leave today," Jonathan said, "but the coach has not yet arrived. Or perhaps it has and chose not to wait for me." Clara allowed a half smile. "Then perhaps it was never meant to take you." He met her gaze and nodded once. "Oxford will be there. Whether I am or not seems less certain." She stepped beside him and looked out over the green where the children of the village were beginning their morning lessons in the chapel hall. Their voices, like larks, carried faintly through the breeze. She noticed one girl watching her, a dark-eyed child, with a braid tight against her back, clutching a slate. The child tilted her head, not in suspicion, but recognition. "She reminds me of someone," Clara murmured. "Of you," Jonathan replied. They stood together, the silence between them, neither brittle nor strained. Clara turned slightly and reached into her satchel. From it she withdrew the ribbon-bound letter Jonathan had once written and left hidden among Edward's effects. She held it out. "I read it only once," she said, "but I remember every word." Jonathan accepted it without unfolding it. "And do you believe them?" he asked. "I do not need to believe them," Clara answered. "They are yours. That is enough." From the narrow road, the sound of a cartwheel over gravel grew louder. A peddler passed, with bells on his reins and barrels in the back, nodding kindly as he passed the pair. Life moved, as it always did, indifferent to revelations, but open to quiet transformations. "Will you remain here?" Jonathan asked. Clara looked toward the hills beyond the village, where the smoke of hearths drifted into the blue, for a time. "I may take rooms at the old schoolhouse. There is talk of turning it into a place for reflection, a retreat." He raised an eyebrow. "A convent of sorts?" "No," she replied, smiling. "A sanctuary for the ordinary, for women and men whose burdens are not grand but heavy, where silence is not enforced but welcomed." Jonathan tucked the letter into his coat. "Then it will be needed." Clara looked up at him. "And you, will you seek your own sanctuary or only knowledge?" He hesitated. "Both if I can, but I no longer see them as separate." She nodded, satisfied. Then, with the gentlest of farewells, a touch to the sleeve, a glance held a heartbeat longer than necessary, he turned and began walking toward the far gate. He did not look back, and she did not call after him. Such partings, they both understood, were not endings. They were beginnings of a quieter kind. Clara remained at the gate until his figure vanished behind the hedgerow. Then she returned to the path and made her way toward the schoolhouse, where she would begin rearranging the furniture left behind by forgotten scholars, stacking chairs, dusting windows, readying space for those yet to arrive. In the garden behind the chapel, spring bulbs had begun to stir beneath the soil. The earth, still dark and cool from winter's breath, had begun to open itself once more. It made no sound in its flowering, no boast in its renewal. It simply received light and offered beauty. So too did Clara Wren, daughter of a vanished mother-niece to a troubled man-companion to a restless seeker. She bore no title, held no office, promised no doctrine. But those who came to her in time would find themselves changed, not by her teaching, but by the presence of someone who had chosen to stay when others fled. And in that choice, quiet though it was, lay something enduring, not certainty, not triumph, but peace. Life, as this tale gently reminds us, does not always resolve itself in full clarity or thunderous conclusion. Sometimes the deepest reckonings come in whispers, in footsteps that do not echo in letters unopened for years. Clara's path was not of vengeance or revelation, but of reconciliation with others, with the past, and most profoundly with herself. What are your thoughts, dear reader? Does peace arise from seeking or from surrendering the search? Share your reflections in the comments below, and if this journey stirred something within you, press like to let us know.